Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. Pleasure to have you for our original series as we begin Maseches Horayos. Now, one may think that since this is the shortest Masechta that we are recording an episode for, it will be the shortest episode. But no. The shorter the Masechta is, probably more information about how it was learned and what was written about it, what wasn't written about it, which Rishonim, which Achrayim. So stay tuned. But as Rabbi Brod always says, as mentioned in last week's parsha, he always has Rachmanis on us, and he's not going to keep us too long. But for any further questions, please reach out to Rabbi Doctor. He anticipates hearing, especially the people that take objection to things that he says. He tries not to be controversial. Maybe he should be more controversial. Either way, reach out to him. Tell him what you like, what you don't like. If you want to sponsor an episode, that will be phenomenal. And of course, check out his website, eliezerbrut.com, where there's just new things happening there all the time, and you won't regret it. Without further ado, we have to mention we have a sponsor for this one. This episode has been sponsored for the success of David ben Sophia, or David ben Sophia. He should have much hatzlacha in all his endeavors. And without further ado, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut on Maseches Horayos.
Okay, so basically, as you said so beautifully in the introduction, this is a small, very small Masechta. 13 and a half blot, whatever it is. Okay, so number one is that we like to point out sometimes there's a zman miyuchid to learn the Masechta. So it seems that there was a minig in the Rav Teichtel, the Baal Mishnah Sachir, or in other circles famous for the Ima Banim Semecha. He had a minig that he would finish Masechtas Horayos to be Messiah for Erev Pesach, because he couldn't pick a big Masechta to do a siyum. He had to do it because he had a son that was a Bechar. When this is he's talking about, he says I had a lot of he's busy Rav, so he couldn't pick a big Masechta to be Messiah. So it's a small Masechta, so he would do it. And then afterwards, after his son got old enough, he kept up with this minig. So that later on, he met Rabbi Yitzchak Weiss, also a famous Hungarian Rav, who told him that this is also the minig in Pressburg from the times of the Chassam Sofer. And they connected it, dafka, to learn it in the days before Pesach, to something to do with the days of the Nesiyim, the Yud Beis Nesiyim, and they dafka will learn it then. He says that over here in the Elef Ksav, so he told him a reason, he didn't remember, then Rav Teichel didn't remember what the reason was, and Lamaisa in the Mishnah Sachir of his, Archaim Simon Lamed, he talks about this minig again of his, and he tries to explain some reasoning behind it. Okay, so we always like to find such a thing. We had some other Masechta such a thing also. There's certain times that people had a minig to finish the Masechta, not kashor to Daf Yomi. We'll see more about that soon when people actually learn Horayos. We'll see some more Marmakayim in this episode. But just one other Nakuda before we always begin. Sometimes if we're zoiche to find the words of the great Reb Zevin somewhere buried in his writings, we always like to quote it. So in a book review of a chibur, which we'll discuss briefly towards the end, he talks about a chibur written on Masechtas Horayos. So he says Masechtas Horayos at first appears as a small little Masechta. But dafka, and not only that, early on, which we'll also discuss briefly, it was published in the back, you'll see Yerushalmi, which we don't find any Masechta in Shas, has Yerushalmi in the standard Gemara. He says, Lamais, even though it's so small, but the sugis are chamurais and the halachis are amukais. It's be'etzem shaykh somewhat to kachim, but there's a lot of other sugis in here, and it's in all, it's a beautiful Masechta. There's a lot of Geshmak Agalta also, and now we'll mention briefly throughout the ages about this Masechta. So number one, we always like to talk about, we always mention throw out there, the Ger Sais on the Gemara. So Baruch Hashem, this Masechta still has the Ktukei Seifrim. And in recent years, in 2005, Mechon Avet Shalom published a volume, which we'll discuss more about, but one of the things in this volume is they have a Ksav Yad, that they found another Ksav Yad that the Ktukei Seifrim did not have, which was published by Rabbi Tzal Dublitsky on the whole Masechta. Very, very important stuff in here because it shows different a lot of times when we have these manuscripts, it shows the Rishonim, which we're going to hear about, how they exist, the few Rishonim that they're on this Masechta, that sometimes in our Girsais or the Girsais of the Tuk Yisrael, we don't have a Makar for, but in this Nuk Savyad that they found in the Gemara, there is Makaris for these these Girsais of these Rishonim. Okay. Mechkar, there's just one book to mention. Tzvi Ari Steinfeld wrote a massive book on Horayos. Okay, fine. Ga'ainim, we always like to throw out there also. So in recent years, the new project of Eitz Ga'ainim, continuing with Bam Levine's earlier project, headed by Rachmiel Brody and others. So they have a few pages of Ga'ainim, but nothing major. Okay, so now what you say like this: you open up your Gemara, and if you're using an art scroll, I don't have art scroll in front of me right now, but if you open up your standard Shas Vilna, so it looks like Horayos has a lot happening. You have Rashi, a ton of Rashi. You'll notice right away something unique, that there's 2 columns of Rashi, not Rashi and Taisus, mamish a ton. And then on the bottom you'll see Taisus. You'll see on the side Rabbeinu Chananel. On the other side you'll see Taisus Rush. So it's jammed already the sides of more than a standard Masechta that you learn. Now the question is, was it always like that? The answer is if you pull out, if you have handy the first printing of the Shas, the Bramberg in 1520s, you'll see that if you open up the Shas, the Gemara is very, very empty. The page, all it has is Rashi. It doesn't have Taisus. So much so that they already write on the Shar that we printed the Gemara, the Yerushalmi they call it, which we don't do up till now. Why? Because there's no Taisus. We don't have Taisus, so we need you to have some material. So they go out of their way to put in on this Masechta the Yerushalmi. What happens? We just said in the Shas Vilna, if you open it up, there's Rabbeinu Chananel and all these other things happening. Okay. So first, let's just throw out there about Yerushalmi. This accident, or whatever, it's not an accident, they were doing, which I've mentioned in the past a few different times. A lot of times, different printings, they needed material, so each one would try to up the next one. So even early on, in the Masechta of Horayos, where they didn't have, so they had to go resort to Yerushalmi. Turns out these pages of Yerushalmi help for those that are Isaac in Yerushalmi, which especially in, let's say, in Masechta like Horayos, where you're always scrambling for as much information as you could. So Shaul Lieberman has a very important article where a whole big study on Yerushalmi Horayos through this piece, these Yerushalmi that Bramberg, by mistake, put in the, or not by mistake, just to make sales, they put in the back. It helps out a little bit. And in general, the Yerushalmi on Masechtas Horayos is very hard. Shaul Lieberman points to that the Noam Yerushalmi from Rabbi Ezel Charif already has great difficulty. He has to play around a lot with the Neschayis of the Yerushalmi. Okay, so now we go on and we look at Rashi. So I already said that there's something unique happening over here in Rashi. It's 2 columns. Now, one could say that the, as one notices in the blot in Horayos, they're very packed blot, so it's not the end of the world why there's more, looks like there's more Rashi, because it's proportionally, there's so much on the blot. But is that true? Okay, could be the stam, this Masechta is more Meirich. We'll have to wait for someone to make a word count mechkar. So it turns out that different people at a certain point in time started saying, maybe it's not Rashi. So already the famous Torah Tamima, Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein, said that he suspects it's not Rashi. Later on, or around the same time, Professor Yaakov Nachum Epstein, based on his expertise in Rashi and the Lashonis of Rashi, says it's not Rashi. And because of this, other people also did. Rabbi Margolis says it in his work, and Rabbi Avram Seifer also points out that it's not Rashi. Now, recently, in again, referring back to this volume that Ahavat Shalom published in 2005, Rabbi Tzal Dablitsky did a massive study on Rashi, on the Masechta, and his conclusion is it is Rashi. Shum Panim V'Ofen, it's don't say that it's not Rashi. And he points to not only that, he located a new manuscript of Rashi, which is very important in the sugya of Rashi. So first, that's his maskana. He points to 2 points that are very valid in this conversation, but some of the people, especially Yaakov Nachum Epstein, was aware of this point, and he also deals with it, which plays out. We've discussed already in a few different Masechtas about which is it really Rashi or not. So he points out, L'maisa, Rishonim bring down Rashi, the Rishonim which we're going to talk about shortly, they bring it down as Rashi. Another thing is the Chidah, which we're going to talk about his relationship to this Masechta, also refers to Rashi the whole time. And he was one of the people that we've mentioned in previous episodes. When it's not Rashi in a certain Masechta, he'll point that out. But Lamaisa experts, I spoke to various people. One expert told me even if it's not Rashi, it's a short from the base medrash of Rashi. Another person told me no, maybe it's more likely it could be it's Rashi. And we know there's a famous topic which you also touched on in the past that sometimes Rashi, there was different maduras of Rashi. So as the time went on that he worked on it, he fine-tuned it and he even cut it down to be more exact. Anyway, Lamaisa, this is a unsolved thing, but as I said, in the edition, Rebbe Tzal Dublitsky, his conclusion is that it is Rashi. Okay. Now, what no one pointed to was, what's the earliest source that even suspected that it might not be Rashi? Betzal Dublitsky and others, when they talk about it, they refer to the Tarei Tamima, but it turns out it's much earlier. In the Chibur Minchas Yehuda, which I've quoted a bunch of times, a Yid that was a Volozhiner Talmud who was zeicha to learn Shas Be'iyun with the Nachlas David. He was a wealthy man, and he wrote a beautiful sefer, which I've quoted a bunch of times, called Minchas Yehuda. And already there, in his few pages on Horayos, 2 times, he also himself points out that this is not, he thinks that there's something up with this Rashi. Okay. Anyway, now this gets to another part of the story. We said if you open up Yishas Vilna, you see Rabbeinu Chananel on the side. Is this Rabbeinu Chananel? Right away, more recent years, they pointed out that this is not Rabbeinu Chananel, but it is an early Rishon. It's Baruch Me'eretz Yavam. Okay. This is based on all the mechkarim of Professor Shraga Abramson, Yaakov Epstein, Tashma, Simcha Emanuel, and more recently in the From Haredi journal online from Eitzar Chachma called Ha'Eitzer, which we've quoted in the past a bunch of times, Dr. Pick is Mesakeim all these shitas, and this also plays out in Rashi, also as he sets up, if Rashi had Rabbeinu Chananel or this Pirish, and he talks about it also. Okay. Anyway, so the point is, we're now seeing there's a story about Rashi on the page and Rabbeinu Chananel on the page. Now, what about Taisus? When does Taisus come onto the page? So, it turns out like this. First, what is the most famous, earliest Chashava Achron on the Masechta? So it's known as the Ber Sheva. Now, what's interesting is the Ber Sheva is published in 1614. He's a Talmud Muvik of the Lavush. He has askamas from such people as the Maral, his son-in-law, others, and his Rebbe the Lavush, and he writes a chibur on a few Masechtas and Shas. And the point that he was doing was the Masechtas that didn't have Taisvis. He was writing a chibur mamash to be doima to Taisvis. So already in his point in time, there was no Taisis on the side still, and he was trying to, I guess, in some way also even mimic the way Taisus would learn up and put that down. Now, the Ber Sheva is considered mamash one of the Gedolei Achronim. You could see already from the Askamas how they talk about him. But more than that, he has a fascinating Hagdama. I'm very fond to say that a lot of times you get an insight, a whole world can be revealed to you from this Haskama, this Hagdama of this Mechaber. And basically he talks about how he was zeicha to learn this. First he says something which relates to the episode that we just released on the Chazon Ish, that he was zeicha to learn with Shimush Chachamim u'b'dibur Chaverim u'b'pilpul Talmidim, all these different aspects. He spent a lot of time learning. But Kitzer, he gets to Masechtas Horayos and he sees it's mamish. There's nothing going on. There's nothing on this Masechta. There's no Taisus even. There's a few marmakaimis and there's mistakes, and he doesn't know what to do. So he's going to start learning it. And when does he learn it? With friends. Bein Hazmanim. Again, here's an early time where the lashon of Bein Hazmanim can be found. And he didn't think it's going to take so long. How long is it going to take to learn this Masechta? It's a small little pitch of Masechta. Lamais, he ends up learning it. He's being ma'ayin into the sugya and he spends years on it. I guess in my terms that I'm fond of using, he falls into the rabbit hole of Masechtas Horayos and he starts learning it mamsh. Now, he uses the following terms that he doesn't miss out, going through Bavli, Yushalmi, Tosefta, Safra, Sefri. It's Kamashonim v'yagati, and he works on this Masechta and he puts it out. Now, eventually, he does this type of mahalach to some other Masechtas, such as Tamid, which we'll have to wait to discuss. He sends off this Chibur to Eretz Yisrael. And one of the reasons why he sends it off to Eretz Yisrael is because he felt that maybe they'll be able to assist him, because in Eretz Yisrael they have rare Gemaras. He calls them ancient Gemaras from the times of Chazal. And so he wanted to make sure to see if they talk about the Gersais, because he also is fond of the Gersais. Okay, interestingly enough, he gets Eretz Yisrael. It seems they're very fascinated by the Sefer. It seems an illegal edition of this Sefer gets out there, which he's not too happy about, and then he publishes it and says, don't use that as first edition. And make a long story short, he also talks about, he gets into Kabbalah, how he's very into Kabbalah and how he got to that. And he mentions over here that he gets hooked up with Rabbi Zariman, the Ramami Pano, and most importantly, Rabbi Yisrael Sruk, so basically he's getting what he says direct Messiahs from the Arizal, and other fascinating things can be found in this fascinating introduction. So the point is, he started out. Why did he start learning Zechta? Because it wasn't learned. He thought there's nothing on it. He'll do it at Pesabena Zmanim, and then he falls into it, spends years on it. Okay, but what? And that, okay. So the point is that there's no Taisus at this point, and this is 1614. Lemaisa, fast forward a bunch of years later, and all of a sudden we find Taisus is published. Now, how this Taisus is published, when's the first time it's published. So we'll always we refer to one of my favorites, Rafael Nassan Nata Rabinovich, the Baldik Duke Seifrim. So he talks about where does it come from. So it seems that in some editions, early editions, it said that it's from a Reb Elio Ettingen. So it seemed that certain people assumed that this was a Baal Taisus, one of the Baal Taisus with such a name. Avad, it's not, says he brings down, it's not. That it just means that he had the Ksav Yad, and he brings down that this is what Steinschneider and Dr. Zunz, they also came to the conclusion. But the point is that this Yid, turns out we know about this Yid. He was alive, he was an Adam Gadol in 1645. He publishes a sefer called Bris Halevi, an interesting sefer, which is available on Hebrew books. And he somehow had a manuscript of Taisus, and eventually, many years later, gets published. So you can look more about it in Marvin Hell's book, Printing on the Talmud. And again, Tzal Dablitsky, in this book put out by Mechor Yerushalayim, he talks about it. It seems it was published for the first time in 1695, or maybe a little later in 1720s. Okay. So Bekitzer, now we're seeing how Taisus gets revived, so that's why the Beersheva doesn't have it. Fine. What about Taisus Rush, we said? So Taisus Rush is published in 1725 in Prague, and it's very important, not only because it's a Taisus Rush and every Rishon that we could dig up on this Masechta called Horayos we want, but he brings a ton of Ramah. Ramah we've spoken already in a few different times already in Masechtas Baba Basra, Sanhedrin, so we'll tell you to look there. It's published based on a manuscript from the Shittim Mobetzes, who had a crazy library, which we also mentioned. And again, Betzal Dablitsky talks about, he publishes not only that, a new based on new manuscripts of the Taisus Rush in this edition of Masechtas Horayos published by Havat Shalom, and he also discusses the chashivas of what he has found. Okay, so at Kan we see the story of how the Rishonim come to print, so to speak. What about the Achrayim you want to learn besides the Beersheva? Is there anything else? So in 1732 is published the great Orach Chaim HaKadosh, his Chibur Chayfetz Hashem. One wants to learn about this Chibur in general, even though it's not so much on Horayos, but we have to mention it. And you can look in Rebuva Margolis' Chibur on the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, which was recently published by Mechon Ahavat Shalom, even though it was published earlier, but they got manuscripts from the nephew of Rebuva Margolis and more materials, a fascinating edition, Kedai to look at. Okay. Fast forward, we have the Chidah. As people listening to these episodes in general will know, I'm very fond of the Chidah. Here we have something very unique, which is like this. We have a Chibur that the Chidah wrote on Shas. In general, we don't really have Chiburim that the Chidah wrote on Shas. Masechtas Horayos is I think the only Masechta that he wrote up straight on Shas. We say we have a lot of his material on Agadah Gemaras, but as a Chibur on a whole Masechta we don't have except this sefer. Not only that, this is his first sefer that he published. Interestingly enough, he's publishing this when he's very young. He wanted to publish it already at the age of 31, right in the beginning of his travels already. He wants to publish it. Lamaisi publishes it when the age of 33. When one opens up this Chibur, we are blown away, because a lot of times you think, Adam Gadol, it takes time to become Adam Gadol. Already at 31, he's already this Yid who's holding in all the manuscripts and he's holding in everything. And when one learns the Shar Yosef of the Chidah, we see he's full-fledged. He's already involved with manuscripts of the Gemara that he saw. He's involved with manuscripts of the Rishonim. He saw the Meiri before we have it today, but he already saw the manuscript. He already mentions in his Magal Tov how he saw the Taisus Rush. Now, he didn't know about that, the Prague edition 1725, which is in his lifetime, because he didn't travel yet to that area. So he saw it and he discusses it and he uses it. The Ramah it's very important for him, and he handles with all the Ramas throughout this Masechta. So Bekitzer, this and Chaval, when you see this, you first could see the unbelievable Mahalach Halimut of his, Bavlis, Yerushalmis, everything is going on over here. Mayrich, and this is an incredible, incredible sefer. It's available. It was republished a bunch of different times, and I believe Ahavat Shalom we'll discuss how it was reprinted shortly. Now, one Zaitika Yediyah that comes up, which plays out with Masechtas Horayos and the Netziv's and the Chida's travels. So I apologize, but I just feel that I have to mention it. I'm very fascinated by the Chida's travels. So interestingly enough, we discussed a bunch of times. The Chida wrote his travels when he was collecting money for Eretz Yisrael. In one of the early entries, in one of the first years of his travels, he writes that he gets to a place in Germany, and he meets different people over there, and he describes that he meets this Rabbi Yosef Adayan. He starts talking to him and learning, and he's blown away from his charifus and his bekius. And he says, this guy shows me his chedushim on Horayos, and he uses a lashon kemat ka'oimik v'lashon harav hamarsha, which is a praise. Then he says it's Ma'irdik Bekios and Roiv Shas. Okay. Then he says, I saw that I was mechavantim in a lot of things. Now, what's interesting is because these are the years when the Shar Yosef, he's working on the Shar Yosef that we're just talking about. So it's pashut that he's holding this again. He's being nispal at this yid. So then says the Chida, Birachti Baruch Shechelit Mechachmasai, that I saw this Adam Gadol and I made a bracha on seeing Adam Gadol. Now, we know in the Chida, we have the travels. He doesn't say this except one other time when he meets the Pnei Yeshua, and he met many other people, as one could see in the thing. So, to me, it's pashut. He meant literally, he made a bracha on this Adam Gadol. Now, he seems to be fascinated with this person already in the work on Masechtas Horayos. He quotes him a bunch of times. And other times he was Eicha, and not only that, in the Shem HaGdolim he talks about him, and it turns out that this Yid, he writes about him that this Yid he used to finish Shulchan Aruch, Daled Chalakim every month. I mean, Mishunadik thing, he was a Sinai, he was Eicha Harim. And it turns out this Yerushalmi Yid, or Eretz Yisrael Yid, the Chida, Chevron also, whatever. So he is being the spol at this Yekesh Yid, and it turns out he meets his Chaverim. It turns out this Yid had two Chaverim. One of them was the Zichron Yosef, which we spoke about in the Get of Cleves episode. Another one was Rabbi Yaakov Berlin, and they learned in the yeshiva of the Shev Yaakov. And the point was, these were all Gedolei Olim, they were all very close, and the materials they quote each other in their materials. Lamaisa, this Rabbi Yosef didn't publish anything. I located that the manuscripts of his still exist. I was able to publish many years ago in Yeshurin one drasha of his when I discussed this whole episode and this whole story of the Chida when he's meeting him. But this is just a cool thing. You see, he's learning Horayos, he meets him, he discusses with him, he's blown away, he ends up making a bracha on him. Okay. Fast forward to 1802. 1802, all of a sudden, the story turns to Prague. There's a Yid there, Rebbe Tzal Ranjberg, born in 1762, dies in 1820. So this Yid, he turns out, he was a Yid, he just sat and learned. He did not want a Steller, he was offered Stellers, and he just plugs away. So in 1802, he publishes a chibur called Hayra Gever, which is a chibur on Horayos, where he's mavar everything, as he says in the Shar. He sets out to be mavar kol Hashanis Hamus b'Gemara, Rashi, Taisus, Rosh, and he says even the Yerushalmi and the Rambam I talk about. Okay, now this, when you look at the Sefer right away, we have a letter over here from Karl Fischer, the famous censor of Prague. A lot to discuss about him, but the point is, it has three eskamas, very chashuv eskamas. One of them is Rebbe Eliezer Fleckless. Rebbe Eliezer Fleckless says, you're going to say, why should he print the Sefer? Everyone knows Harber Svarim and Kates. Now imagine, in 1802, they're already talking about that there's too many Svarim out there. Imagine what they would say about today. Now, Rebbe Eliezer Fleckless in his Askama says, I know already the old Taina, which is a known Taina, that after the printing press, there were certain cynics that already said that when the printing press came out, it made it terrible because everyone thinks they have to publish a Sefer. Now, so this is fast forward in 1802. He says, don't think Chas v'Shalom, this Sefer is something unique. So it's a fascinating thing. And Avada, the story of Harber Svarim and Kates, and as it plays out, Al Hayoim is its own story. Now, Kitzer, he gets Askamas from different people, different Gedolim people that he had, who were his Rabbeim, just to mention, is Meir Fishlis, and the Baal Or Chadash. So they gave him Askamas and the Sefer Emek Sukkos, a chibur of his on Nida and a chibur of his on Chulin. The chibur on Nida was only published from Meiser Cook a few years back, but Chulin and Sukkos, I believe, were lost. Now, as I again already even said, this episode, Hagdamas in general are fascinating when they have information. In this Hagdama, he gives Akaras HaToiv to all his Rabbeim. So he gives you a whole glimpse into all the different people that he learned by. And each one, it's its own story, which Mirz Hashem, if we one day I hope to give a whole episode, or at least one or two, about him in depth. But basically, he sits and plugs away and learns. He gives Akaras HaToiv to his wife, thanking her for running the store, being able to mefaris him. He thanks his shver for supporting him X amount of time. And all his different rabbeim he talks about over here. But Kitzer, he sees that Horayos is sitting on the side, no one's learning it, so he decides to sit and learn. And he's miyageya, and he learns it properly. So now he says, okay, there's a Taisus. So he talks about Taisus. He handles who is the Taisus, and which we already discussed. He adds in his own 2 cents. He adds in some interesting piece of information. But he says, bottom line is, it's very bekitzer. It needs a beer. Then he tells you about the Taisus Rosh, which we also spoke about. It's also bekitzer. He talks about the Beersheva. He says also there's a chibur everyone knows, the Marsha. He says interesting thing. I always say, many episodes I've mentioned that when the Marsha himself says that B'derech Klal, if there's a chibur of his on a Masechta, means he learned it with Talmidim. Says Rabbi Tal Ranjberg, he suspects Horayos he didn't learn with Talmidim because of the way it's written. Okay, I'm not Baki and Marsha to say such a thing, but I definitely trust Rabbi Tal Ranjberg. One could look in his chibur, he Bechlal was into the Marsha, and the chibur that Mechon Shalayim published many years ago of collecting his other materials. You see that he has a lot of Horayos on Marsha, so he knew this. He talks about the Ar Chaim HaKadash's work, and then last but not least, he says he knows that there's a chibur of the Chida, but he doesn't have it. It didn't get here. He tried to get the Moiches Svarim to send it to him, but Bekitzer didn't come here, and I'm very sad about it. Okay, so you see already that the Chida in 1802 is known about him in Prague. It's known that the Sefer is out. Now, mind you, as I said, it's already out for a while, but not always does this farm get to different places, and he's trying to get it. Interestingly enough, the Chida did get a hold of this Sefer. Not that he quotes it in the Sefer because it's published in 1802, and before he dies, he quotes it in one of his farm. This is a Yediyah found in the Hagdama, a fascinating Hagdama, all about this great Gadol in the Mechon Yerushalayim edition of the Chuvas and other writings of Rabbi Tal Ranjberg that they published. Okay, now just to finish up, just a few other Yediyahs on this Masechta. Number one, the Netziv Valazhin, they learned this Masechta. It's clear. The Netziv even says a few times, some Lashon that I didn't notice by him often, but he says, "V'davar zeh lamadti min hashir," means say Talmida Yosem Mikulam, and the Netziv says this in Hagdama to his Heimek Davar on Chumash. That part of the idea when he giving over shir to the Chumash, he was Meir on different ideas, which is known from Chazal. So he says this a few different times, a few different ideas. It came to him while through this concept. Another thing is we see a great usage of the Beersheva, and he quotes the Rashash with a Lashon Zatzal, so this would date that Valazhin learned this after 1872 l'chayra. Another chibur on this Masechta is the Keren Oira, which we also mentioned many times, another great Litvische chibur. Another great Litvische chibur that's tied to Valazhin is the Eluf HaMagin, published for the first time in 1912. Now, what's unique about this chibur is it was done by 2 people. Ramartcha Gimpel Yafi, which I believe in the past I've mentioned him briefly, a Talmud Muvik of Rabbi Yitzchak Valazhiner. His father was a Talmud Muvik, but Rav Dov Ber was a Talmud Muvik of Rabbi Chaim Valazhiner. And this Yid, Ramartcha Gimpel Yafi, was one of the great Gedolim of Lita until he made Aliyah Seif Yamav to Petach Tikva. A lot has been written about him. I recommend highly the various articles of Eitam Henkin where he discusses a lot of fascinating materials available in an English book in Hebrew about Ramartcha Gimpel Yafi. In Rabbi Sein Shabagayil, there's other materials about him. And he wrote it with his brother-in-law, Reb Nassan Nataluria, another great Litvische Talmud Chacham. And there's a fascinating Hagdama where you see they talking about learning together and putting out something together, which happens to be very, very unique. In the past, I've mentioned there's very few Sfarim that are written b'chavrusa. One of them I am very fond of quoting about is Daderis. When he was 13 years old, him and his twin brother, they put out a chibur, a work that I said on one hand is very depressing, on one hand is beyond amazing, of klalim of Gan Shas, from all the Taisus in Gan Shas, the Mefalpel and all the klalim, and they put this out as twins together. And there's Kiyadua, which we mentioned in my first episode relating to Old Daf, which was about the machine matzah controversy, the controversy with the Shalom Meshav and his brother-in-law, Ramot Hettinger, and they learned and put out many Sfarim together. Which is interesting is, Ramot Gimpel, they put it in their Hagdama, they mentioned such a thing. Already then I mentioned that there's a Sefer Mishkan Saram that questions what we know Mevid Davar B'Shem Amrei, or we know Sfas of Davis Bekever. So how does it work when it's two people? So what Ayin Sham in his Chibur, how he handles it. But the point is that they put out the Sefer. They didn't put out the Sefer. Actually, the son of Marta Gimpel Yafi set out to publish various materials of his father, and this was one of the works that he published. It's a fascinating Chibur on Horayos. Now, why the son publishes it? Also because he says this Masechta is a Meis Mitzvah. So even as far as 1912, it was not a learned Masechta. Okay. Fast forward to the late 1950s, there's a sefer from Ephraim Garbaz called Har Ephraim, a Lamdish sefer on the Masechta. He was a Talmud of the Divrei Cheskel, one of the greatest Litvische, the pre-war standard Sfarim of the Litvische world. Fascinating sefer, fascinating. Always, it brings back fond memories of the youth. I used to love this sefer. Now, so he's a Talmud of his. He makes it to Eretz Yisrael. And as Askamas from Brisa Zalman, Rav Herzog, and this Yid was a fascinating Yid, like many other fascinating Yidden we have. And Reb Zevin wrote an excellent book review, which is what I quoted in the beginning of the episode from Sefer V'Svar. Okay. Fast forward to get to the conclusion of this is like this. In 1969, so first we see that there is Svarim on the Masechta here and there, but it's hard, you have to get to it and everything. Okay, Baruch Hashem, Shas Vilna put a lot on the page, but in 1969, the Ganachowski family publishes was called by one of my rabbeim, called it the Big Black Monster, a giant volume, bigger than the biggest Shas Vilna Gemaras, which has in it. They went out of their way to collect all the materials that they were able to locate, including manuscripts on Masechtas Horayos. They published it in 1969. Now, when I was in Beis Medrash at the time, I was learning Horayos. I was desperate to get a copy of it. It was very rare. And one of my first items that I went hunting when I came to Eretz Yisrael was for this gigantic big black monster, and I located it, and I paid a lot of money for it. And but the problem was it was so big you had to lug it around, you could barely use it, and the letters are tiny. So it starts out with the Rishayim, and has they got a hold of the Rimalonil, the Meiri, the Piskei Rid, and then they had even a Pirish on Agadas, which if this is the author or not is its own conversation. Rabbi Dayu Hapnini, and then they have tons and tons of achronim printed, not manuscripts also. So basically you're left with, if you could get a hold of this sefer, no excuse, because you have a ton of information. The only problem is you need to have, it's gigantic, but even though it's gigantic, you need to have a magnifying glass. It's tiny letters. Now, this same time, they publish the Chidah, which is also this massive sefer. So you have to walk around these two massive sefer. Okay, so very unfair. Baruch Hashem, in the early 2000s, Ahavat Shalom goes ahead and publishes it in a smaller size. It looks like this. And much more user-friendly. It's still big, but you could lug it around easier. The icy it's a shame it's small. So if you pass a certain age or if you don't have the right glasses, it's going to be a problem. But no excuses. Now, Baruch Hashem, today we have Oizvada and we have ArtScroll. So they use this. And we have to mention also the Mitniks put out Avodas Brura, also based on hundreds of... So all these three Svarim are Likutim Svarim on the Masechta. They outdate the famous other earlier... Likut Svarim on the Masechta, Imre Ben Yamin from Rav Guzak, and there was the Chibur from Rav Ram Ganachowski, Cheder Hirasi, also on Horayos. So Bekitzer, Horayos, even though it's a tiny Masechta, is a ton to learn. Even the blotter, even though it's the blotter full blot, is a lot of Rashi. Get ready to learn it, and you can have lots of fun with the Masechta. There's Agadta also, and that's all we'll talk about Masechtas Horayos. We'll have Rachmanis on the audience. As you said, I have to have Rachmanis.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Doctor, and thank you to our sponsor. Again, it was dedicated for the success of David Ben Sophia and Rabbi Brut. There's only 13 days to learn Masechtas Horayos. What are we supposed to do with all the books that you want us to lug around?
So you just use ArtScroll or Oizvahadar and you're good to go. Actually, no, I saw advertisement. We have to say this. I saw advertisement. I don't know what it is yet. I didn't see, but there's a special Gemara for Eli Stefanski Shir. So I don't know what that is. It's a new, it's art, it's his own thing. I have to see what it is.
Yeah, it says easy to read MDY style translation or
Okay.
something.
So we'll have to
Yeah.
wait to hear the book reviews about this Gemara, what it is. Competition to art scroll, I don't know. Anyways, yeah.
Okay. Why were you learning Maseches Horayos in Beis Medrash?
In my yeshiva, where I attended Beis Medrash, it's called Yeshiva Shar HaTorah. And one of the Rosh Yeshivas of the yeshiva is a Yid named Rabbi Shalom Spitz, who is my uncle and Rebbe. And he's fond of the Maseches Horayos. He's given many, many shiurim over the years in yeshiva on Maseches Horayos, toward Matzah Shabbos and stuff like that, as extra things. So already then we were learning Horayos, so we all knew about Maseches Horayos. So that's how I started with Maseches Horayos.
Incredible. Okay, so now we're looking forward. I think we may need special episodes on this because we're starting Seder Kachim.
Correct.
And Seder Kachim is its own world.
Wow, yes.
Its own world of lack of Rishonim, lack of Achrayim.
What is there?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the whole development of the Brisker Yeshivas on Seder Kachim.
You'll have to call in. We could flip the mic around and you could give the take of all the years spent in the Olam HaBrisk of the Torah Sheba'al Peh or the Torah Sheba'Ksav today already, also of somewhat of the inner scoops of what's happening.
Yeah. So we have to get a hold of some of the heftas. We start introducing these words to the listeners now.
Yes,
heftas, the notebooks of the Talmidim.
The notebooks, and yes, exactly. All the notebooks.
Okay. The authorized, the unauthorized of shiurim that are out there. But Rabbi Brat, I trust that you're going to do a thorough job on researching this topic.
I as I said it many times in the past, I stop by World War II. If I mention something afterwards, that's fine, because I especially this I can't.
No excuses for Kachim. Kachim only started after World War II.
That's what I have to show. My job is to show that what was going on before World War II. Now, then, the many Olam and Brisk, they'll shoot me. So I can't talk about topics that I'll be getting too many emails of all the mistakes that I made. I wasn't zeicha to learn by the Brisk tradition of Eretz Yisrael.
Any of those people who are listening to this episode are on the emails. They could handle it.